Welcome to Culture, Religion, and Technology. I'm Bambi Francisco Roizen. Well, since the start of 2025, there's been an increasing boldness amongst Christians to carry their cross daily and proudly. You could just see it from all the articles and the essays that have been written chronicling this revival from to is America on the brink of another Jesus revolution to from atheism to awakening, Gen Z turns back to God to the Silicon Valley revival has momentum. Next comes maturity. Well, joining me to talk about that revival in Silicon Valley as well as across the country is Paul Taylor. He is director of Unify at Transforming the Bay with Christ, where he connects pastors and churches across the Bay Area. He was also a pastor at the Peninsula Bible Church in Palo Alto. Paul, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me, Bambi.
Yeah, I want to, we were going to cover quite a bit, but I want to start with your pastoral days. You were pastor, as I mentioned, at Peninsula Bible Church in Palo Alto. So I'm curious, can you tell us a little bit about the church? What's the denomination and how many congregants does it have?
Yeah, PBC is about 75 plus years old, started in the 50s. I started attending when I was a freshman in college at Stanford in 1995. But it was actually really born out of, or experienced kind of its heyday during the Jesus movement of the 60s and 70s. And so really experienced a lot of growth during that time. There's kind of the old story of the initial pastor's wife who she and her friends would all wear the white hats and white gloves to church, and they realized that the new generation at the time was not wearing white hats and white gloves, and so they made the decision to stop wearing those things to be more welcoming to kind of a new generation of people turning to Jesus. So it's a non-denominational Bible church, very focused on teaching the Bible. Most of the sermons are just verse by verse going through the scriptures. About 1,000 people these days call it home. Um, right in the heart of Palo Alto, a lot of Stanford students, a lot of tech people. It's a great community. Really, a lot of kind of mature believers that are really passionate about their faith and passionate about scriptures.
Well, I recently spoke with Phil Eubank, the
Yeah,
pastor at Menlo Church, and he told me that he's seen a doubling of his congregation in this last several years. I think COVID had something to do with it. What has been the attendance like at church? Have you seen an increase in attendance?
yeah, it's definitely been growing. I mean, I think a lot of churches, and I speak with a lot of pastors these days, a lot of churches are seeing growth. And I think, there's lots of different inputs into that situation. There's post-COVID, there's kind of this new awakening to faith. I think AI and related technologies are causing people to ask questions, deeper questions than they've asked before. Um, at PBC over the last several years, we've seen a lot more people coming willing to ask questions and willing to engage with those. A lot of international folk coming to the area as well. And so at PBC in recent years, there's a big Russian community, kind of a Slavic community, as well as Singaporean community, there's a Mandarin community, there's a Spanish speaking community, Ukrainians. It's cool because there's a Bible study with Ukrainians and Russians that meet together, and that's really encouraging given the political situation. So yeah, it does feel like there's kind of a new season of people coming to faith. It's exciting.
So you talked about how with the with AI and ChatGPT and everybody trying to understand whether they could be super intelligent. Clearly, there are these questions now being asked, which is what does it mean to be human? These are very religious questions. That's one of the reasons there's curiosity. Is there other reasons you think you can attribute the growth of your church and the curiosity in Christianity?
Yeah, I mean, it's so hard to describe what's happening culturally and to pretend to attribute motives to it. But I do think tech has a big part of it. I hear a lot of people, like you say, that question, what does it mean to be human? That just seems to be like the question of the day. I mean, I've been asked that question by the person cutting my hair, by the person checking me out at the grocery store, It's like that is a normal topic of conversation, and that wasn't the case 5 years ago, that people had these deep questions kind of on the tip of their tongue. And then I think COVID and the loneliness crisis, people are seeking real, authentic community. And that's what Christ came to do, is to redeem people and to build a community of children of God. And so I think places that can offer love and sacrifice and friendship and intimacy and all of those things, that's people are just so hungry for that. And so it drives them to communities of faith.
Well, it's interesting because you had two pretty great opportunities before you're a pastor at Peninsula Bible Church, but you also started to work at Transforming the Bay with Christ. And I think you decided to work with Transforming the Bay with Christ because you're a lot like me in that you kind of dip your toes in two worlds. You you were at Oracle at one point,
Yeah,
the workplace. It really is in need of some sort of boldness about our faith. Many, many years, I'm sure when you started at Oracle, you didn't talk about your faith much. I know I didn't when I was at CBS when I started and when I talked
yeah,
to tech companies. So you left the church to work at Transforming the Bay with Christ, despite the fact that your church is growing itself, which is interesting that you made that shift. Why did you make that shift to leave this growing church and move to this organization?
yeah. I mean, there's a lot of reasons for it. I started connecting with Transforming the Bay with Christ about 12 years ago. It was founded about 12 years ago by Pat Gelsinger, the former CEO of Intel. He moved to the area from Portland, and he observed that a lot of the churches in the area didn't know each other. Pastors weren't connecting very deeply. And so he wanted to do something about it. And so he started calling people together, and I was part of that initial group that started forming, 20, 30 people. And then over the years, TBC has fostered networks of pastors all around the Bay Area. So I was leading a network in kind of the Mid Peninsula, Lower Peninsula region, Palo Alto, Sunnyvale, Mountain View, up to Menlo, down to Santa Clara, kind of that region. And I've been leading that network for the last 10 years or so. And so the organization was going through a shift, and the person who was running those networks and leading the networks, the role of director of Unify, was moving up and kind of taking over the executive role of the organization, which vacated that spot. And so it really was the draw of that position. It was kind of this thing that I'd been doing, not on the side, but it was not directly, serving my local church. And the opportunity to step into that role came available. And really nothing else, I think, could have had me leave being a pastor. Other than that, there were also some different dynamics. My wife is a pastor as well, and she was working at another church. So we were pastoring at two separate churches, and that was great, and also had some challenges. And so it felt like this is an opportunity to be back at the same church. Now I get to be a pastor's spouse rather than a pastor, and I get to be a pastor to other pastors. And so it's just kind of a shift in roles, but it's such a privilege to be able to see what God is doing all around the Bay Area.
I'd say when it started 12 years ago, it was, easier to bring a lot of these pastors together. But now with so much polarization, even in the church, it seems like what, I guess, how are you attracting the pastors to unify? And what is it? What's the purpose of bringing them together?
Yeah. Yeah. So we have about 48 networks now that we cultivate. Each of those networks are led by usually 2 to 3 or 4 pastors. And each of those networks has, the smallest ones probably have 5 pastors, and then the largest ones have 50. And so we really work with those network leaders, and we help them to cultivate networks. Most of those are geographical based networks. And so we have them. Our definition of the Bay Area runs from Salinas to Santa Rosa over to Dixon. So there's 11 counties that we cover. And our basic premise is that geography creates mandate. And so we believe that when you're serving a church in a local region, our invitation to pastors is to think of themselves not just as a pastor of their particular church, but to think of themselves of having some responsibility for the region that they minister in. And because there's many churches in that region and they're all doing different kinds of things, but similar kinds of things, we really encourage them to form relationships. And that's what was transformative for me as a pastor was we have this kind of chart that shows a path where the initial inclination of a lot of pastors is to see other churches as competitors. You have kind of a market mentality, and if they grow, I shrink. And there's a certain number of customers, and we're all fighting for the same customers, and that's just not at all what the kingdom of God was meant to be. And so we kind of observe that you start as competitors and then you move into companions where
Mhm.
pastors get to know each other and form real relationships with each other and realize that we're all serving the same God, doing the same kinds of things. We're not at all in competition, but we are companions on the same journey. And then as those relationships grow and deepen, it moves from companionship to collaboration, where
Mhm.
then you can say, how can we serve the needs of our city better? How can we collaborate? And that doesn't mean merging churches. There's different churches for very good reasons, and there's different kinds of churches, but it means, how can we take care of schools in our region? How can we help with foster care? One of the really exciting ways that happens is when a crisis hits, it's really helpful for the churches to know each other to respond. We saw that up in Santa Rosa when the fires happened several years ago. And, the city needs help, but they can't call 50 churches. But if
Mhm.
they can call one person who can call the 50 churches, then there's the opportunity for the church kind of to mobilize together. So that's really what we want to see is we want to see churches form real relationships with each other so they can serve their local communities in more effective ways.
Yeah, that sounds like a great resource that you provide
Yeah.
pastors. How does it work with Amplify and Multiply, which are the other two sort of organizations within?
Yeah, yeah, great question. So Unify is the effort to create those relationships between pastors and churches. And so we kind of create the network. And then Amplify and Multiply both build on that network to do different kinds of things. So Amplify is really the cause-based movement. And so using those networks to then help churches to respond better to the needs of their community. So often that's things like foster care, education, homelessness, disaster relief. Our Amplify director is working right now on a resource mapping project to map all of the churches around the Bay Area to know who's got a refrigerator, who's got generators, who's got cell phone chargers, so that when the next disaster happens, we can immediately click a button and say, here's the churches that you can go to for a cooling shelter or a warming spot, or those kinds of things. So that's Amplify is really helping churches collaborate better, and then Multiply is church planting and evangelism. So, how can we grow the church presence in the Bay Area? And there's a lot of research that shows church planting can be one of the most effective ways to reach people with the gospel. So, we work with a lot of other church planting organizations to make connections, to foster collaboration, and to train church planters. We love to see when our networks of pastors, when a church planter moves into the area and they say, we're glad you're here. How can we help you plant your new church rather than seeing that new church as a threat or a new competitor on the scene? How can we come alongside them and help them to grow a new church? So that's kind of what Multiply does is really help that and then do different evangelistic efforts, ways to collaborate together in proclaiming the gospel and helping people to encounter Jesus.
I see this as sort of a LinkedIn for pastors because you can also, with your Unify, kind of help, I guess, support the new churches that are being planted with pastors who may be looking for something like that. How many churches have been planted in the Bay Area that I guess the your organization can be partly responsible for?
That is a great question. I wish I had the number. Um, TBC, we work a lot of kind of behind the scenes networking. And so we are not a church planting organization, but we support church planters. And so There's several dozen, I know, probably in the kind of 30 to 50 range in the last 5 or 10 years. It may be higher. I'm not as familiar with that area, and I've only been in the role a few months. Um, but church planting is hard. It's really hard, particularly in the Bay Area where funds are so difficult. And so we really try to wrap our arms around them. And there's a kind of a incubator, kind of like a Y Combinator, but for church planters that we help support, that trains them, and they meet monthly up in San Francisco. And it's so exciting to see people that come together with that vision for how to start a new church.
Is there really an incubator, a church incubator like a YC?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, it's great.
if
We partner with them, and
what's
they just basically run a support group for church planters and train them every month and connect them to each other and resource them.
So I was going to ask you, your mission at TBC is to have the Bay Area become the most kingdom connected metropolitan region in 10 years. And the question I was going to ask is how will you measure that? One way would have been how many churches are being planted,
Yeah.
but how are you going to measure success?
Yeah, and we kind of like to caveat that mission by saying one of the most kingdom connected because, it's not as if we exist in competition with the other metropolitan regions. Um, but we really feel like we have, in some ways, achieved that. I mean, we are now one of the most kingdom connected regions in the country. And TBC is also part of a network called City Leaders Collective that works with, I think, maybe 50 to 70 networks like TBC in different cities around the country. And they're all doing great work and they're all fostering networks. I think TBC is one of the larger ones, one of the more connected ones, but there's a lot of them that are doing incredible work. And so we're starting to ask kind of now that we have this unity, now that we have these networks, what do we do? And what is God calling us to do with them? We gathered with actually just this past Wednesday, 2 days ago, we gathered with 65 network leaders in Palo Alto for a day-long time of learning together and connecting with each other. And that was the question we were asking is, here we have hundreds of churches represented by these network leaders in the room. What does God want to do with that unity? And how do we serve the gospel and proclaim Jesus through that? So it's an exciting time.
Well, I know one of the ways to spread the gospel, and I think you have a heart for it, is to really help people in the workplace,
Yes.
like people uh, sort of deal with their faith and in ways that potentially may conflict with some of the things that they have to do at work. You mentioned a few of those people in an article we found you in, which is Can Silicon Valley Find God? But I think you were also elsewhere, you were also interviewed. You mentioned an engineer whose success was measured by how long they could keep users engaged. We all
Yes.
right? That's what AI and that's what tech's designed to do is how do you keep users glued to the screen? But at the same time, this person is limiting the screen time for their kids. So, but I was curious that, you brought the story up, but then there was no reconciliation. What did she, it was sort of like, what did she do?
Yeah.
Did she reconcile that?
Well, that particular individual ended up leaving the role,
Oh, okay.
partly because of that conflict. But
Hmm.
I know others who have found, ways to mitigate that. And so that's the kind of thing is, being a Christian in the workplace is challenging, but there's no easy answers. It's not like, well, you should just quit or well, you should just stay. It's really what we really help people to do. Um, we really want to help people follow the Spirit's guidance for them in their particular settings because God calls us each differently. And so I know folks working in tech who are trying to keep people engaged, but give them more agency in how they're engaged. And I know other people who say that's hard for me and I can't do that. But we really believe that for a lot of Christians, so this is kind of my other part of my work is working with an organization I co-founded called Faith Work in Tech. And um, we really believe a lot of Christians just end up checking their faith at the door when they step into their workplace because it's complicated and it's hard to figure out what they have to do with each other. And so we really want to help people be integrated in understanding what those two things have to do with each other and learn how to listen to the Spirit in their work.
So how would you like to see the workplace change? What does that look like? What's acceptable and what adheres to, so the establishment clause, which is separation of church and state. Um, how do you
Yeah.
how do you talk to them about what they can or can't do at work?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things is that we talk a lot about being agents of shalom in the workplace, and so shalom is just it's the Hebrew word. I'm sure you know this, but the Hebrew word for peace, and it's one of these dense words that means 50 different things. It's hello, it's goodbye, it's peace, it's wellness, it's wholeness. It's kind of this very holistic sense of things being the way they ought to be. And so we think that Christ came in order to bring shalom to the world, and he charged his followers with being part of that work. And so, you may or you may not be able to talk explicitly about Jesus, but you can look around your workplace and you can bring shalom in 100 different ways. We talk about how every workplace has a built-in caste system where some people have more power than others. And every workplace is a place of injustice to some degree. And so you can walk in there and you can say, who's not being listened to? Who's not being paid attention? Whose voice is being quieted? And you can work in very small ways and sometimes very large ways to right injustice in the workplace. You can bring attention to people who have really good ideas but don't get listened to. You can find ways to treat customers better or respect your clients in different ways. And so there's kind of this very holistic way of representing Christ in the workplace. And then there are times where it is appropriate to talk explicitly about Christ. And I think, you can't be a jerk about it, but you shouldn't be anyway. And so if people have legitimate questions, you can talk about your faith, and there's really powerful ways. I think that the workplace in some ways is the new kind of, you know, city square, the cultural marketplace where people with different ideas and different value sets come together, and you end up having conversations on business trips or in downtimes that are often very deep and very much about the real things of life. And so we want people to be able to embrace those opportunities and be willing to show up, even if it's risky.
What do you think about praying before a company-wide dinner or event? I prayed once before my company. It wasn't a huge at the time. It wasn't a huge,
Uh-huh.
maybe like 15, 20 people. My husband said maybe you shouldn't be doing that.
Sure.
And I said, it's a private company.
Yeah.
Everybody knows I'm Christian, but I only did it that once. All the other time I was hesitated.
Yeah. That's one of those things where, I know different people with different convictions, and I think I think if it's a personal conviction and it's, you know, Jesus somehow found a way to be very true to his mission and to God, but he didn't exclude people or make people um he made people uncomfortable for sure, but not in the ways that often we end up doing so. And so I think there are ways to say, hey, this is what I believe. It's really important to me. I'd like to offer a prayer if that makes you uncomfortable. You know, please feel free to talk to me afterwards, or feel free to just kind of check out or something. I think there's ways to do it when you're in those roles, and then there's ways to just offer private prayers. We have a whole set of kind of prayer practices that we encourage people to do in the workplace, and those can be really transformative for the individual. And then it can be an opportunity for people to kind of notice what's going on. We encourage people often to just ask people, hey, can I pray for you? And most people won't turn down prayer, even if it's awkward.
Yeah.
But those kind of personal or one-on-one settings usually are a little bit more effective than the
And,
public large group.
but although that's not illegal to do that, if it's a private company, you should be able
Right.
to do that. You may annoy certain people and lose some people, but
Yeah.
do that. Yeah.
And we know some founders and business owners that do that. And that's, I think often people are able to kind of build that into the culture of their company in a way that's really winsome, and in a way that says, the culture of our company, and this is what we believe, or this is what I believe personally as the leader. But
But
without,
you ever looked into whether is that could somebody be could that be considered illegal? Could be if you're a company of a Fortune 500 company, would that be illegal if the CEO says, I'm going to have this company-wide dinner, we're going to, start with a prayer of grace?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think it's illegal, but I feel like I can often be naive about the intricacies of our legal system, so maybe it's more complicated than I realize.
Maybe something good because if it's not illegal, I think that's something people could be more bold about. So
Yeah.
you wrote an essay about a Silicon Valley revival, and the way this can have lasting impact is through a framework called exilic discipleship,
Yes.
was framed by David Kim. This perspective arises out of Israel's exile, circa 700 BC. And simply put, it's that we should consider ourselves a minority culture in a foreign world, constantly under persecution. In this era, I believe this is part of the discipleship, is that we need to be actively engaging, whether it's active evangelism or just through boldness of our faith. Is that correct? Is that sort of what exilic discipleship is?
Yeah. Yeah, we have a whole framework on this. One of our key programs in our nonprofit is an 8-month discipleship journey where you do a lot of theology and biblical instruction, you do spiritual practices, you do some self-exploration to discern God's calling on your life. But one of the modules is focused on this exilic discipleship framework. And the kind of basic idea of the exile is that there's some conflict between what you feel internally about who you are and the environment that you're placed in. So there's a tension between kind of my identity and the culture around me, which is a common feeling for many people. For people, followers of Jesus, there's a particular way that that often plays out. And because of that tension, there's there's kind of this difference between me and my identity and the environment. We say there's two ways that people tend to resolve that tension. So the one way is to just remove yourself from the environment. And so there's kind of this escapism. And the church has often been guilty of this, where you establish Christian conclaves and you just kind of withdraw from culture so that you only surround yourself with people that think the way you do, and then you don't feel that tension of being different than the world around you. The other way to solve the tension is to become like the environment around you and to kind of lose your internal identity, to lose your distinctiveness. We call that syncretism, where you change your values because of the tension. Um, but we believe this kind of model of exilic discipleship means you actually expect the tension, that you embrace it, that you live within it, that there can actually be something even beautiful and powerful about that tension of what it looks like to be something that exists in contrast with the culture around you. So Daniel, the book of Daniel's kind of one of the prime examples of this, where he was somehow able to maintain his identity, maintain his integrity. The stories of Daniel are incredible about how he was boldly able to maintain his integrity in the face of actively serving an empire that was completely against the purposes of God. And I always say that, if Daniel could work for Nebuchadnezzar, then you can work for anybody. Because Nebuchadnezzar was the icon of evil in the Old Testament. I mean, he was as bad as it got. And presumably, Daniel, he was his chief of staff, and he was able to make Babylon better through his efforts. And he was presumably good at his job, or else he wouldn't have been fired, he would have been executed. And so he was a really excellent chief of staff to the king of Babylon while somehow maintaining his identity as a worshiper of Yahweh. So that's
Yeah.
kind of this incredible model of how do we, none of our companies are as bad as Babylon is. And so how do you find that way of maintaining integrity?
Well, I mean, you also have to have incredible faith in Christ, and in the face of being thrown in a den of lions,
Right?
there's that.
There is that.
Most of us aren't that courageous as Daniel is. And wasn't he a teenager around that time?
Yeah. I
He's
mean, he was young. Yeah,
14, 15. I mean, it's incredible.
it
Um,
is.
yeah, and I do think that, yeah, he stood his ground. He did his job, but he stood his ground, and he was willing to give bad news, right?
Yes.
He just told the truth. And so that when I think of exilic discipleship, I think that, and I wrote a piece about this. I think that I think of sort of evangelizing not only grace, but truth.
Yes.
And in my essay, I wrote, we've over-indexed on grace,
Mm,
under-indexed on truth. And so in many ways, this is confrontational, but you do say, you're going to live in this tension. If you want to live in this tension, you're not going to be a mouse about it and just allow this tension to consume you. You might want to confront the tension. And I think, and hence why I want to be an apologist, or hence
yes.
so, but that's the type of your active engagement you're espousing, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And, taking Daniel as a model, God came through and rescued him over and over again, but he didn't know that would happen. And so he took very real risks and he was willing to sacrifice and willing to, you know, in his case, risk his life. In our cases, sometimes it's risking our jobs, but there are cases where God calls us to take risks and trust him. And maybe that means getting fired. Maybe that means getting censured by HR. Maybe there are real consequences, but I think you're right. We can't be afraid of those consequences. We have to trust God that he's going to provide for us
Yeah.
as he calls us into some risky situations.
Yeah, so I'm trying to be bold in the workplace. So I don't know if you know that we've Vader has held a number of events covering
Okay.
so the healthcare was a big deal. We also had a fund, so we invested in a lot of healthcare. We
Mm,
invested in a lot of particularly behavioral health companies dealing with mental illness.
yeah.
And so I found that there's a certain, and this may get a little tense here in our conversation, but it's true. I found there's this certain ideology that's pervasive in healthcare. And that ideology, believe it or not, is sex on the spectrum. And there's money
Mm,
behind that. Sex reassignment surgery is expected to grow almost 11% compounded annually to over $6 billion by 2030. That doesn't even include some of the other medications. By the way, this is real. I've interviewed a couple number of CEOs who've told me about this growing market,
yeah.
me that this is a big deal and something that people should invest in. As a Christian, I stayed mum and I said, that's interesting. But then at the same time, I've become more bold because I actually
Yeah.
don't think it's right. So how does a Christian who works in healthcare navigate this situation? For me, I don't work for these healthcare companies, but I did have a point where there were people saying that they wouldn't sponsor
Mm,
or suggested people shouldn't sponsor what I do because of my views. How do people, so that's me. But you are talking to a number of people in the workplace who work in tech. Healthcare is huge.
yeah.
Is this a discussion that's come up? How do you help Christians navigate this?
Yeah. I mean, it's a great question. And I think it's kind of your particular situation is played out in different industries in different ways where somebody has a conviction that doesn't line up with how the industry is doing things. And so then what do you do? How do you keep it to yourself? That's kind of the escapism withdraw. Or do you change your mind? That's the syncretism. Or do you embrace that tension? And it's just never a black and white thing. It's not, that's what makes it hard and difficult is it's a daily, it's not one decision of do I speak up? It's 100 decisions of do I speak up and when do I speak up and what tone do I use and who do I talk to about what? And
Yeah.
it's the constancy of it. It's not if it were like a single, do I do this one thing or not? That might be a difficult decision, but it would be kind of manageable. But it's the daily, it's the everyday, it's all the interactions. And so I think my answer to that would be you need to, really learn how to listen well to the spirit because you need to listen every minute and you
Mhm.
need a community around you of people who help you to say, what do you think about this situation? What do you think about that situation? And I think the temptation for a lot of pastors, a lot of people expect their pastors to know the answer to every question. And I think that puts like a burden on the
You're
pastors.
the Uber pastor, so you should have all the answers.
Yeah, and what do you think should, my boss is asking me this question about this case, what should I do? And a lot of pastors just go ahead and try to answer, but I think that my approach would be to, hey, let's cultivate a community of people that also have the spirit, that also can think and pray about this. That, if you're in healthcare, you should be talking with other Christians in healthcare that face similar things. And that they're going to be such a greater help than, the pastor can provide some theological guidance, but in terms of those specifics, having a community of believers around you that can help you think through that. And they may have different ideas. They may say, well, I would do it this way, but that might help you realize that you should do it the other way. It's not that everybody is going to agree or have the same decision,
Mm,
but it's kind of out of that mix of community that I think we often find our voice.
yeah, I think so. But and also just the just being in touch with the Holy Spirit, the conscience,
That's
right?
right.
Is is fortunately has a guide in
Yeah,
there.
that's right. And that's the problem is, we talk about that a lot. We call it disintegration, where people just aren't integrated when they go to work. And so they kind of, you go through all your 8 hours of your workday or 10 hours or 12 hours or however long your workday is, and you never think about God and you never interact with the Spirit. And so we found that's actually one of the kind of low-hanging fruit is, you can set your timer on your phone for some time and just stop for 60 seconds and pray. And that kind of breaking that, you kind of break open the door of the Spirit at work, and it often can really be transformative because it helps you to relate to the Spirit more throughout the day.
Yeah, no, I think that's important. I try to listen to my Bible app the very first thing I try before
Yeah.
anything happens. I try to do that. Doesn't happen always, but I would say 90% of the time, or 6 days out of the 7 days of the week, that's happening. And my husband and I do Bible yoga. So we just
Oh, nice. I love it.
yeah, and get our exercise in. The yoga in anyway. So we only
Right.
do it for during yoga. We don't do it otherwise. We just do it. We're still on Psalms, by the way. There's so many. We're really happy with Psalms 133. We're like, that is the shortest Psalm ever.
Yeah, that's great. Psalms are so rich. The
It's
Psalms
a
are
rich.
great for work. Yeah.
It's fun. It's fun. And we're trying to get through the Bible. So we're on Psalms. So I think I think it will probably get through a lot during the dark days of winter, the cold days when we're inside more and we're not out.
Yes.
So,
That's
okay.
great.
I want to move to, I mean, I want to move to I want to move to politics, just put that out there, because in this quest to have the Bay Area become the most connected Christian metropolitan region, I think you have to deal with all aspects of the
Yeah.
workplace and I think politics. And one of the reasons I think and you can tell me whether you think this government needs to be aligned, or involved. I'm bringing this up because I believe we see a Christian revival in the tech sector because
Mhm.
of prominent Christian conservatives like Peter Thiel, who have been outspoken critics of the anti-Western values, culture, religion that's been predominant over the last 10 years. And because the current government is aligned with Christian values. So I'll just give you a couple examples. Earlier this year, President Trump established a religious liberty commission to support parents whose liberties were undermined in education and healthcare. For instance, and I covered this, the Montgomery County, the school board forced the kids to read certain books. Those would be LGBTQ books. The other executive order was defending women from gender ideology, which today blocks men from playing in women's sports. So, my first question is, do you agree that this government and culture are now aligned with Christian values?
Um, I would say that question is always going to be not a binary answer. I don't think there's any human institution that is perfectly aligned with Christian values. And so there are ways that different governments and different parties and different administrations have been aligned, and there are ways that they're misaligned. And so it's always a complex. So there's ways that that's true, and there's other ways that maybe it's less true.
Okay. How do you think politics should be involved in your mission, if involved at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the church has often, because politics can be divisive and complicated, the church often withdraws from politics and tries to be kind of apolitical, which I think is an understandable temptation, but is not the best way to approach it. The reality is that our churches are filled with people who, you know, have very strong political affiliations on both sides of the aisle. And I remember early on talking to a couple that I was officiating their wedding for, and he grew up in suburban Chicago, and he was taught that being a Christian meant being a Republican. And his wife grew up in inner city LA. She's Latina, and she was taught that being a Christian meant being a Democrat. And so they had to learn how to bring those things together and understand that the different communities and settings and different priority of issues that they were encountering shaped some of those things. So I think our churches ought to, above all, proclaim the kingdom of God. And the kingdom of God can never be one-to-one assigned to any earthly kingdom or any earthly ideology or political movement. And so our churches can, and a lot of them are navigating the tension well of being able to call people towards allegiance to Jesus Christ above any other political ideology. And so we did a sermon series that I wrote several years ago. Actually, it was right during COVID. We kind of designed it and then ended up preaching it in 2020 with about 30 churches around the Bay Area did it together. It was called One Kingdom. And the subphrase was Kingdom Allegiance Before Political Alliance. And it was, how do we pastor churches recognizing that there are different viewpoints and creating spaces for people to interact well versus just throwing arguments at each other, and creating spaces for people to have real dialogue around the issues that are substantive but that they disagree about.
Mm. I want to ask you about that in a couple of churches in particular, but um, I sent you the essay by David Brooks, who wrote a piece titled "We Need to Think Straight About God and Politics." In that piece, Brooks is critical of the outpouring of worship at Charlie Kirk's memorial, alongside with all the political rhetoric. So you told me that you agree with much of what Brooks said in that piece regarding relationship between politics and faith. What don't you agree with?
Uh, Good question. I'd have to go through line by line and see.
If you
I
remember.
think, yeah, I'm not sure I'm prepared to answer that directly, but I think that generally kind of the finding ways to elevate worship of Christ and to acknowledge that political issues are complicated and are often not one-to-one aligned with Christian values, creating spaces for dialogue. That would be kind of my highest priority.
Which I think he said. I guess the areas I disagreed with would he would say the people at that memorial, he says, seem to have no coherent idea about the proper relationship between um, faith and politics. So it was a definite critique. Um, and then at the very end, when he concludes that he hopes Republicans will not look at their opponents as evil, and then count suffering as, on the evil side as permissible, which is ironic considering Charlie Kirk died at the hands of an assassin.
Yeah.
So a couple of things that I disagree with there, but it just seems hard to I think part of the challenge for getting Christians together, even to unite in the workplace, right, is having differences. And the one I mentioned to you about, your view of biological sex, which is driving the healthcare industry. But all of this is, and this is the stuff that's in your workplace that you have to deal with. But it's also a division that's happening in the church. This,
Mhm.
and I wonder, in fact, I see this as the fissure in the churches today. For instance, your old church, PBC, or your current church, well, you're going to your wife's church, but the PBC has a statement like this right on the front page: we believe in traditional marriage between a man and a woman, right? the pastor of that church, I'm sure they would be very, very cordial to the church, the pastor of Stone Church of Willow Glen, but they're complete opposite. Their mission is to be extremely exclusive and advocate for social justice, right? Extremely exclusive, inclusive of LGBTQ. Not that PBC isn't, but the other churches for sure welcoming that of
Yeah.
sexual, lifestyles. I guess, how do you get these two? Have you gotten pastors like these together? And do they realize that this is something that is extremely critical because it drives their view on sexuality affects people,
Yeah.
children, the economy, healthcare, startups? I mean, it is a foundational viewpoint. How do you get those two to come together and be aligned? And I I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, again, it goes back to dialogue for me. And I think for me, the real critical thing here is where are we getting our ideas from? And so if somebody wants to have a conversation with me about whatever it is, marriage or sexuality or politics, and they want to argue from culture or they want to argue from their experience, then that's going to be a less productive conversation. But let's look at the scriptures. Let's look at the Bible. Let's look at how God speaks to people through his revelation. And let's talk about how do we interpret that. And the Bible is hard to interpret. And I have very close friends that think very differently about how to interpret very important passages of the Bible. Um, and I really believe that that the Spirit guides the church as a community to have those kinds of conversations. And so, um, with regards to the topic of sexuality, I would love to, and I've been in settings where pastors have had conversations about how do you read the Bible and how do you come to a biblical theology on sexuality. And there are people that come to different viewpoints. And so, for me, as long as the conversation is centered around interpreting the Bible, it's going to be a helpful conversation. And I believe what I believe. I have my convictions on certain things, but I'm also, one of my favorite theologians used to say, he said, I think I'm probably 80% right in my theology. There's probably 20% that I've got wrong. The problem is I don't know which 20% it is,
Yeah, I like
or else
that.
I'd change it. And so, I'm humble enough to say, I've got my convictions and I've got the way I read the Bible, but I know for a fact that I'm wrong on some things. I just don't know which ones they are. So I would love to listen to people that have other viewpoints and argue from scripture to say this is why I think that. And then let's see, maybe, I'll find out I'll find out in eternity which ones I got wrong and which ones they got right. And
Well, that's why I love this. I got this from
oh yes.
I thought, wow, they did a lot of work. I'm going to read. I had to print it out because this is something that I just can't read on my computer. So,
Yep.
I was reading through this, and then I saw that you left to do another job, and I said, okay, I'm going to read this another time. So
Oh great. Yeah, I put that together probably 10 years ago.
that's
That was
yeah,
a while
so
ago.
that was great. I mean, I started reading. I read about half a dozen pages or so. Let's talk about prior revivals. In your piece, Silicon Valley Revival, you refer to the Great Awakening, in the 1730s. What was really interesting that as I was reading about the Great Awakening, that there was also a 60-year period between that. There's a 60 between the Great Awakening and then the Second Great Awakening.
That's right.
Then what's really interesting is that we had the Jesus People movement 60 years ago, and
Mm.
now we have this revival. So coincidence? What's with the 60 years?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a great question. Um, I certainly wouldn't presume to put timelines on God's work, but certainly revivals do come in waves, and I think that the cultural forces that are at work today. Um, I don't know that anybody would have predicted a revival today, but we've been praying for it. We've been praying. I and probably you and a lot of people I know have been praying for a revival in the Bay Area, praying for people to come to know Jesus in new ways. And when those kinds of things happen, they're always a bit of a surprise. it's rarely, I was just talking to my wife about this yesterday, and she was saying how, you always have to expect it in ways that you're always kind of working towards this thing happening in this way in this room. But often the way God works is it happens in the room next door, or it happens in ways that you're not quite anticipating. And so, really embracing this with a spirit of humility and openness and wonder and worship. And so, I do think God's doing something unique in this season. And it is interesting that kind of the Jesus movement went through here, yeah, a generation, 2 generations ago, and it's a different culture, it's a different set of people, and God's going to work in a different way now.
And I noticed in the Jesus People movement, I was reading a little bit about that. I mean, there's a lot of what's happening today that that could set up another revival. And one being, again, the sexual revolution back in the 60s,
Yeah.
the mistrust of the government. But what was interesting is that I saw that there were about a couple million people converted during that time. And then if you look, which is good, but then if you look over the last 50, 60 years, we've seen a decline in the number
Mm.
of people who would affiliate with a religion. So I guess my question is, why do you think that movement was not strong enough to fend off the secular humanist, worldview?
Yeah. Gosh, that's a great question. Um, I think culture moves in waves, and there were a lot of factors that contributed to that, particularly in the Bay Area. I'm not sure I have a great answer to why things didn't last, but the article that you referenced a couple times, what our encouragement, at least for today, is not just to rely on this kind of exciting moment and exciting wave, but to say, what does it look like to do what Eugene Peters said the long, slow walk in the same direction? The way of discipleship is not often exciting and energetic. It can start that way, and there's moments of that, but it's a faithfulness over a long period of time, and it involves really being willing to die to yourself, to rethink the way you think about things, to see your life transformed, to listen to people you wouldn't necessarily listen to. I mean, it's a long and sometimes painful process, and God works through darkness and crisis in our lives in ways that, in my life, those have been some of the most powerful moments of transformation. So I think my encouragement to people is to kind of dig in for that long haul. And yes, be excited about the new wave, be excited about what God's doing and crowds and energy, but to fuel that into discipleship, to fuel that into persistence and faithfulness and trust through moments where the crowds aren't with you and it doesn't look as exciting as it does at first.
Okay, last question. What can we expect? What are you excited over the next year to accomplish?
Oh, wow, great question. I really, when we gathered with these pastors earlier this week, we used the metaphor, or not even a metaphor, but the observation that the Bible speaks of two different kinds of time. Chronos time is the Greek word that just means kind of like the regular movement of time. You wake up, you go to work, you go to bed. Chronos just passes. Kairos time is a different Greek word, and it's used like when the Bible says Jesus came in the fullness of time. That's the fullness of Kairos. It's this kind of decisive turning point moment. Um, and so I'd say I think your question was, what would I hope to accomplish? And I would just hope that I can partner with God in what He's accomplishing. And I think God is doing something. I think we're in this Kairos moment where things are different. And the best I could hope for is to just partner and kind of be with that stream of God's work and not fight against it and not try to make my own agenda happen, but really partner with God's work and be faithful to His call on me.
That's great. Well, thank you, Paul. And I look forward to seeing God work through you.
Well,
And
thank you. You as well.
so I've been speaking with Paul Taylor and Bambi Francisco Roizen. You've been watching Culture, Religion, and Technology.